So today we got a double video in store for you because we have to go over the second industrial revolution as well as the Age of Empires 2.0. Really, it's more the Age of Imperialism. This is where we see the industrial revolution unfortunately have its most negative side effect, which is the mass exploitation of countries all over the world in the search of cheap raw materials to make cheaper manufactured goods, thus propping up Western economies such as in Europe and in the Americas, but slowly and unfortunately at the disservice to countries all over the world. We're going to see large empires that once existed like the Mughals and the Qing dynasties of Asia start to disappear and fade as we see the rise of Great Britain as the first true world superpower of the modern era. So we're gonna do the best we can to make this video as concise as possible. Hopefully you guys enjoy this and watch it and use it for your own purposes for studying and getting ready. So hopefully this helps. So let's get started. So we need to understand the second industrial revolution. We need to go back to the first industrial revolution. And when we think about it, we went from an agrarian society in which the majority of people were farmers who lived on other people's property, like within the Russian system of serfdom, where the land owned the people as opposed to people owning the people. What we need to really understand though is that once machines and factories started to rise, and mostly in Western Europe at this point, we would start to see a shift from where people were located. As the jobs moved into the cities, so did the people. And as the people moved into the city to get these jobs, there was a rise in the level of status and in terms of their ability to maintain and operate, which came with it. Now, it doesn't come with all bells and whistles, right? So just because you got to move in the cities and move slightly out of poverty didn't make it great. We would see the rise in a lot of new types of illnesses like diphtheria and tuberculosis take form because of its easy spread within a close proximity of these large scale cities with high population densities and minimal hygiene. But what we would see though is the decrease in the price of many goods and services, which allowed people to climb themselves out of absolute destitute poverty. So we need to make sure we understand the difference between they were still relatively poor by modern standards, but of course they were no longer owned by property. So that was a significant difference. So let's talk about how the Industrial Revolution took form. So when we think about the first one, again, farms to factories. But as time moves faster and you have more time to sit and think, you have more time to innovate. And that word innovate is going to be really important for the entirety of this lesson. Because as you have time to innovate, you create more technology. That new technology solves more problems, thus saving you time from having to deal with those problems so you can think about ways to solve other problems. So what we really need to understand is that once we get to the late 1800s, we start to see the rapid advancement and increasing nature of technology, which takes us from riding horses as the fastest means of travel for the better part of 30,000 years to now being able to fly to the other side of the planet in 24 hours. So what we really want to make sure we understand though, is that the second industrial revolution would not have happened without pretty much one type of metal. Metallurgy was really important. For those of us who don't know, metallurgy is like the science and crafting of new types of metal. And we actually think back in human history in eras of metal, like the Bronze Age, the advent of copper and brass and the Iron Age was such a significant moment in human history. But now we've entered the age of steel. We've learned the Bessemer process, which is faster, cheaper, and way easier to mass produce steel, thus creating much stronger, more powerful factories, which less wear and tear and easy to produce. Now that these factories are stronger, more powerful, they take less wear and tear, they're able to produce larger amounts of goods, and they're able to go on and think of new problems to solve. So we need to make sure we understand the Bessemer process, super important, as to moving forward the second industrial revolution. So when we think of the second industrial revolution, we also think of Great Britain. Nowhere else on the planet was thriving like Great Britain was during the second industrial age. They became a global superpower, and for a while they were the lone global superpower. Now, by the end of the 1800s, when Germany started to coalesce into a more unified nation, instead of just being Germanic nations that were all kind of divided and were trying to conquer one another, they would rise up as well. And we would also see the rise of the United States, of course, with its sheer amount of raw material, specifically cotton, that they were able to produce, the United States became a pretty big player in terms of the Second Industrial Revolution. But when we think about the Second Industrial Revolution, we think first to Great Britain. And that is because Great Britain had control of numerous amounts of assets all over the world. Now, we think of Great Britain in terms of colonialization. You think back to, of course, America, right? They had controlled America for a large chunk of time. And during that time that they controlled us, we knew that they had access to raw materials such as lumber, cotton, coal, iron, and rock, but they would expand outward, just not in the United States. Of course, 1776 occurs. In 1783, they signed the Treaty of Paris, ending the American Revolution. Thus, America is no longer a part of them. They still have plenty of assets all over the world, including Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Southeast Asia, India, Australia. They had access to so many different types of ports of call with different types of resources. The abundance of natural resources that they could bring in association with their rapid advancement in technology and rapid advancement of manufacturing made them a significant player in the age of industrialization. So why is it important that it's Britain that's doing this? Well, for a while, if we think back, way back to like when we first started talking about history in this class, like at the beginning of second quarter, it was the West that looked to the East for new technology, innovation, the raw materials that they did not have. We think back to like when we talk about Marco Polo and making his way across the Silk Road and finding access to silk production that was found in like the Mongolians and the Qing Empire. We didn't have access to those type of goods. But now Great Britain, they mass produce all of it. The dependence upon the East really for raw material and manufactured items and luxury items was no longer there. So what we would come to find is that Great Britain became the source of wealth that most of the world would go to for those goods, thus having a negative impact on many other empires around the world, specifically that of China. We saw the Qing dynasty start to bottom out. We would see Middle Eastern dynasties start to bottom out. The Mughal Empire, as one example, we would start to see them start to fade over time because of this sheer impact that Great Britain had over the collection of assets as well as the manufacturing of goods around the world. So now we get to this major part that we need to understand. So Great Britain is now a global superpower. But what does that really mean? How do they even exert that type of control and authority over other countries and territories from far away? Sure, they have a strong military. Sure, they could pretty much go toe-to-toe with pretty much anyone on Earth. But still, time matters. How do you actually even get those raw materials from one place to another and actually have them be usable? How do you actually get all of this stuff back to Great Britain, manufacture it, and then send it all back out? Well, there has to be some innovations in technology in relation to travel. Now, we had talked about the creation of ships such as caravels, large-sided ships that could travel and traverse within shallow waters, thus making this age of exploration possible. But we need things way bigger, way more powerful, way sturdier. If we're talking about resources such as metal, lumber, or things like that being shipped back and forth, this would require steel. This would require massive ships, but more importantly, railroads. The railroad was hyper important for this entire system to undertake. So how do we get goods from one side of a country to another, one side of a continent to another? Railroads became highly effective. Now, of course, in the Americas, these would be extremely successful. The United States did very well with interconnecting the East to the West with railroads. And we would see that that was a major player in terms of getting the United States up into the world as a major factor within the age of industrialization. But Great Britain and its use of steamships would be massive because of their ability to go and import goods from places like Southeast Asia, India, Africa, the Americas, and bring it back into Great Britain, thus turning those things right back out and being able to send those goods out to the rest of the world that they sold, thus making themselves more powerful. Now, we had talked about a system known as mercantilism, this idea that if you have more weapons, you have a bigger army, you claim more land, more goods, more goods, more trade, more money, more power, more guns, more land conquest. And it would just go on a very vicious cycle and continuously expand. We saw that in the original age of imperialism. Well, it's turning its ugly head again because instead of it being country backed, it's now business backed. I mean, countries are now, instead of putting money into overseas expeditions, they're putting money into innovation and technological gain so they could take advantage over other regions and other countries. The advent of electricity made things even more of a race to get to the top. This allowed countries to go and mass produce exceptional technology. Thus, that could be used to make the lives of its citizens better, but primarily to make the country run better as a whole. Now, I'm going to put a pause here for a second because I think I was in the middle of talking about how the world is starting to change a little bit more in terms of the governments. We no longer have feudalistic monarchies, yada, yada, yada. So I really do need to jump this in there because it was in the PowerPoint and it's really important to understand the politics of the world. The world is going through a democratic revolution. There are democracies forming left, right, and center, especially in Europe at the time. So we need to understand, well, what are the politics of the world at this point? Because the politics are pretty important. And knowing that the Industrial Revolution is sweeping the world, and especially, of course, in Europe and America, we need to understand how the politics of those countries had a significant impact as to how it would go. So there's a couple terms that we need to understand. So first off, the word paradigm, not paradigm or whatever you guys would probably pronounce it when reading it, but a paradigm is a way of thinking. So if we share a collective social paradigm, it's how our world thinks and looks and how we act and how we think is what is appropriate to say and what not to say. Cultural paradigms are really important as a way of bringing people together and determining what is right and wrong in social structures and things like that, especially within a political or economic arena. So the current political paradigm during the Industrial Revolution was that they wanted to introduce what's called a laissez-faire system in which the government is slightly hands-off, but is pro-business. Their goal is to try to allow businesses and to thrive by creating the environment for them to thrive. Limited involvement, limited restrictions, enough to make sure that people weren't terribly taken advantage of. I mean, in America and Britain, hardly any restrictions were there, right? 6-year-olds could be working in coal mines and be blown up with dynamite. Perfectly normal. Not the kind of things. Remember the story I told in class of the book by Upton Sinclair about the jungle, the hand and the meat grinder? Yeah, I mean, that's the situation we're seeing. So this laissez-faire politic is the situation, because among the mentality of these industrial giants like Carnegie and Rockefeller, what we're seeing is what we call social Darwinism. For those of us who don't know, it's the idea of survival of the fittest. The weak shall perish while the strong survive. The idea is that the people who make the best products and who are the smartest and most capable will thrive and do well. And those who don't will not be around. So you're going to create a society which is highly competitive because these countries are becoming highly competitive. And how do you maintain that competition? Through things that we talked about in class, tariffs. Countries are going to start taxing their own people to avoid buying products from other countries so that they're more interested in buying their own products. Thus, their country can make more and more money. So as we see, the types of governments and politics and the economy during the age of industrialization 2.0 has really kind of shifted and changed the way people view their daily lives. Remember, we said that they came out of the fields and into the factories, but the biggest issue and the biggest change that they're going to see that is both a negative and a positive, depending on how you look at it, is the changes to the daily life and how their lives are operated around. The introduction to work weeks and the amount of work that they would do and the limitations as to what that type of work might be. It was completely foreign and different to what they were used to, right? People like Andrew Carnegie, for example, was notorious for cutting down salaries and increasing hours, and people would work 6 to 7 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day shifts. It was the conditions were brutal because of this laissez-faire policy that the government would put in that, society was fine with at this point because of the level of competition within governments to outdo other governments in terms of their ability to quickly manufacture, export, and produce more goods. So while these titans of industry were going and taking the hours and cutting the hours of people, or not cutting the hours, actually giving them way too many hours and cutting their wages. They were taking the money they were coming in by going out and finding new experts and finding new innovations that they could get in charge of. When we talked about Carnegie, his role in the steel industry was massive for the main portion of the fact that he created what we now would refer to as monopolies by controlling entire industries, by controlling every facet of the industry, that nobody else could break into that business. So he would just become the only business. And what happens when you have a monopoly is there's no ability for anyone to determine what the quality of a good or product they make is. They can kind of just do as they please, and because they're the only game in town. It's kind of like if you think about how many people actually have anything other than an iPhone. Sure, you may have a Samsung Galaxy or maybe a Google Pixel or whatever, but the vast majority of Americans, if not people on Earth, have iPhones. Apple doesn't have to innovate that much by comparison to other companies because, I mean, they're just going to keep buying iPhones. So when you think about it in that context, the Industrial Revolution, much like the age of revolutions in terms of the Enlightenment period, this is such a fundamental shift from where the world was to where it would become. We are the products. Our current modern 2024 political paradigm is built off of the basis of this idea. And we need to have a good understanding of that because the exploitation that was necessary to build these massive industries had to be put in place during this time. And without things like railroads, without things like electricity, telephone, without the large ships that could get back and forth across oceans with large amounts of stuff, these things don't happen. So it's really important that we have a good grasp of the Industrial Revolution, because all this being said, and there's so much more stuff in the notes that I just don't want to have to make a 9-hour video on. It's really important that we have all of this down, because in order for us to get to where we are now, these are the foundations. This is where the ideas of socialism and communism start to derive from, with people's disgust and dislike of this particular type of stuff that's going on. So we need to really have a good understanding of where we are going as a people. So why do we need to know the Industrial Revolution 2.0, if you will? It's what took the old world and made it what we now call the modern world. Electricity, steam power, the use of steel and machines, things that we take for granted today, we would not have without this era. But the biggest impact that we're going to see that the Industrial Revolution had was a lot of those revolutions that we talked about, like the Haitian Revolution and the Latin American Revolution. Their impacts would be short-felt, only because of now, no longer was it countries or religions that were having this effect on societies and its control over societies. We're going to see a new factor that would control society, and that is industry. Because gone are the days of the Pope being the most powerful person in Europe and kings and queens ruling over feudalistic monarchies that would control the destiny. This would be the rise of industry giants, the Andrew Carnegies of the world, the Rockefellers. We would see the creation of private citizens becoming far more powerful than any political or religious figure could. The rise of the US dollar, the pound, the British pound sterling. Those would be the weapons of the next revolution. It's a financial revolution that the world's going to undertake. This is the rise of what we would now know as the Age of Imperialism 2.0.